Imagine for a moment that you've been invited to a meeting at work. You step into the room, virtually or physically, and you see that you're surrounded by people who, to you, seem so much smarter, so much more experienced, so much more worthy of being in that space than you are. How do you show up? Do you trust yourself? Do you freely share your ideas? Do you ask questions if you don't understand something? If you're like most people, you don't. Instead, you likely second-guess yourself and worry that if you do speak up, others will realize you don't belong in that room. This was my story. I stumbled into the high-tech industry in my mid-20s with a psychology degree and no expectation of ever working in corporate America. Within a year, I was promoted to the role of alliance manager, which required that I regularly attend meetings where I was by far the youngest, often the only woman, and undoubtedly the least technical person in every room. As someone who is accustomed to being a high achiever, I was so aware of all that I didn't know. The anxiety was crippling. I consistently worried that I had nothing of value to share, especially as compared to those around me. Speaking up felt far too risky because I had convinced myself that the minute I opened my mouth, everyone is going to realize I have no business being here. Instead, I would sneak quietly into the back of the room and just pray that no one would ask a question that would out me as a fraud. Fast forward 20 years. I'm now a leadership coach, and the #1 challenge facing my bright, talented, highly competent clients is virtually identical to my own experience. They repeatedly tell me, when I'm in meetings, I feel like everyone is so much smarter than I am. I'm worried that I'm going to say the wrong thing, and everyone's going to realize I don't know what I'm doing. Why do we do this to ourselves? What's going on here? You might recognize this as imposter syndrome, a common phenomenon in the workplace that strikes roughly 70% of us at one time or another. Imposter syndrome is that sense that I'm not as good as other people think I am. I may be performing at a high level, I may be getting great feedback from the outside world, but inside, I feel like a fraud. Imposter syndrome often strikes people who feel different from the majority culture around them. This is why we often see it in women in traditionally male-dominated fields, people of color, and members of other historically marginalized groups. What's deeply unfortunate about imposter syndrome is that those who are most likely to be affected are those whose voices we need most right now. We all know that the status quo is not working for many or even most of us. To create meaningful change, we need diverse voices who will ask questions, challenge old ways of doing things, and propose creative solutions. But if those voices are silenced by fear, shame, self-doubt, pressure to conform, we are doomed to repeat old patterns. I believe that at the heart of this experience is a flawed assumption. When we find ourselves in a room full of people with different expertise than our own, our natural tendency is to assume that we are all in that room for the same reason. Research suggests that we are naturally driven to compare ourselves to others as a way to better understand ourselves. When benchmarks are realistic, this can serve us well. But when we compare ourselves in unrealistic ways, it lowers our self-esteem. When the group consists of people who have different expertise than ours, say technical versus non-technical, and we evaluate them as having greater value or status than we do, we begin to doubt ourselves. We assume that we don't have the right level of expertise, or that others are more qualified or more capable of contributing than we are. In reality, we are not in the room for the same reason. On cross-functional, interdisciplinary teams, each one of us is there to play a distinct role, one that complements the expertise of others on the team. Let's say you're building a house. The team that builds your house has a general contractor, a carpenter, plumber, electrician. Now imagine that the plumber is paralyzed with fear because he doesn't know how to do the electrician's job. What happens to his work? And what happens to the house overall. When I was in high tech and I found myself so distracted by what I didn't know, I was desperate to solve the problem. At one point, I decided the solution was to go back to school and study engineering. Simple as that. I would invest substantial time and money in a master's degree program to learn someone else's job. I was 3 courses into the program when I decided to consult with a senior executive who led our engineering organization. I sat down with him and I said, sometimes I feel in a bit over my head in technical conversations. Do you think I should get an engineering degree if I want to advance my career here? He looked at me like I was crazy. He said, an engineering degree? You don't need an engineering degree. You're surrounded by engineers. If you need to have a technical conversation, bring a technical person into the room with you. You don't need to know everything. As I left that room, I felt like an enormous weight had been lifted from my shoulders. And then it dawned on me. I had never promoted myself as a technical person. Nobody around me thought I had technical skills. It wasn't on my resume. I never described myself that way in interviews. Yet they hired me anyway. And they invite me to the meetings anyway. There must be another reason why I'm here. That sudden realization became a turning point in my career. For so long, I had been so focused on what I didn't know and what I didn't have to offer that I had never taken the time to think about what I did know and how I could add value. From that point forward, I took a whole new approach to how I managed myself, not just in meetings, but on teams more broadly. Before every meeting, I would ask myself one powerful mindset-shifting question. Why am I in this room? Not in a philosophical sense, but in a very pragmatic sense. What purpose am I here to serve? Somebody must have thought I had value to offer, or I wouldn't be here. What do I know or bring that others don't? Whose interests am I here to represent? How can I complement the discussion rather than compete with others on their turf? As soon as I made that simple shift, everything changed. As an alliance manager, whose job it was to develop strong partnerships, I began to focus on how I could best support my partners and best represent my team. That led me to ask more powerful questions, speak with greater authority, and build more trusted relationships. My colleagues and superiors began to see me as someone who understood my area of the business and would proactively bring me into new conversations. Rather than cringe in horror at the thought of sharing a room with someone with different expertise than I had, I developed a confident point of view that would add to rather than compete with that of others. In today's world, we need more diverse voices. We need more people who will ask questions, share their ideas, and challenge the status quo. Most companies rely on innovation to stay competitive. How can companies fully innovate when their employees are afraid to think differently from those around them? How can we solve today's problems if it's not safe to offer new solutions? And how can we embrace and share what makes us special and unique if we are always feeling pressure to be like everyone else? And let's be clear, there are systemic and structural issues that undermine our confidence and psychological safety in the workplace. These must be addressed as well. Every single one of us can do a better job of creating space and making it safe for others to share their ideas. But if we are to ever achieve the true vision of an inclusive workplace, we need to start with ourselves. When we focus on conformity and competition, rather than embrace our uniqueness and seek ways to more boldly share our strengths with the world, we lose and our teams lose. Madeline Albright, who passed away this week, served as ambassador to the United Nations before becoming the first female Secretary of State. She told a story of attending a Security Council meeting at the UN back in 1993. When she walked into the room, there were 15 Security Council members in attendance, 14 men from around the world, and her. She shared that her natural inclination was to hold back a bit. But then she added, all of a sudden, I look, and I see this sign in front of me that says United States. And I thought to myself, if I don't speak today, the voice of the United States will not be heard. So I spoke. While your circumstances will certainly look different, the same principle is true every time you step into a room. It's time to stop comparing ourselves to others and ask ourselves, why am I in this room? Thank you.